Okay, Boker Tov for those on the East Coast, good afternoon for those in Europe, and good evening for those in Israel. A pleasure to have everybody as we start this the 7-part series on Torah in translation, the history of translation, all kinds of interesting questions, various translation, why translation, how we use translation, and it's a pleasure to welcome Rabba Dr. Lindsey Taylor-Guthartz to present this series. She is currently a research fellow at Manchester University, where she is currently investigating the history of Limud, which of course began in England many years ago and has spread throughout the world. And she teaches at the London School of Jewish Studies. She's lectured at the universities of Cambridge, Oxford, King College, and Vassar College. She studied at Cambridge University, Hebrew University, University College London, and has recently published the book Challenging Conformity, The Religious Lives of Orthodox Jewish Women, published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization, which I also think is based in London, if I'm not mistaken. Very sort of high-level publishing, and she was most recently ordained by Yeshivat Maharat this past spring, and it's a pleasure to welcome her for her debut at Torah in Motion. Bakasha, Dr. Lindsey.
Thank you so much. Well, it's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very, very excited about it. So we're going to be talking about the translation of the Bible. And I suppose, first of all, we're going to have to think, why is this an issue at all? But as I hope you'll see, it is a bit of an issue. Part of this is because the Bible was not written in most languages that people speak in the Jewish world today. You know, if you live in Israel, fabulous, great. But even there, as we'll see, there are some problems because modern Hebrew has evolved and it's changed. But for most Jews in the world, I would say that Hebrew is not their native language and that reading the Bible in the original poses a problem, which straight away takes you to translation. And this raises issues of enormous importance to our lives as Jews that very often we don't think about. It's something that, you know, you pick up your translation, you think there's the Torah, there's the Tanakh, there's the Bible, and you might be unaware that actually people are making choices for you that you might or might not agree with. So today I want to start off the series by looking at a couple of basic considerations. Why does translation matter? And why do translations vary if they're all of the same text? And I also want to talk about what text are we talking about when we talk about translating the Bible, and can we make choices about what text we are translating? So those are some slightly more theoretical or value-laden issues, if you like. At subsequent sessions, we're going to look at the history of translation of the Bible, which is over 2,000 years old. So we'll look right the way from the very first translation, which was into Greek. We'll go through the Aramaic translations, the Targums. We'll look at the Middle Ages. We'll also discuss the Masoretes who invented the vowels and the musical notes and what they thought they were doing. I think actually they are our unsung heroes. And we'll end up with a couple of sessions on evaluating modern translations and learning to be a little bit more conscious about how we might choose which translation is right for us. And I would never say there's only one translation, but different people prefer different sorts of translations, and we're going to look at that a bit too. So how you can perhaps think about what is going to suit you best and help you learning Tanakh best of all. Okay, so why does translation matter? Well, translation of the Bible matters because the Bible matters. That's a direct connection there. If the Tanakh is the word of God, if directly as in the Torah or through prophets and other sages, then if it was given in Hebrew, we have the whole project of how to represent it in different languages in a way that is accurate. And we have to understand what we mean by accurate representation. And that involves decisions. So that's true of all translation, but the stakes are much higher when it comes to Tanakh because it is a central text or a divinely given text or a text that is so important in not just Jewish civilization, but world civilization. And in addition, we'll see that there are some theological and halachic issues that come out of the whole translation question. So in spite of the fact that most of us will hear Hebrew at least once a week in shul or when we daven, or we'll have some familiarity, I think most of us would say that we don't necessarily understand Hebrew at a level that would be necessary to read the whole Tanakh. parts of it are particularly difficult, like Isaiah, for instance, is nightmarish, also for modern Israelis. So, and for modern Israelis, this is a thing too. And quite recently, an experienced Bible teacher called Avraham Ahuvia translated the whole of Tanakh into modern Hebrew. It's called the Tanakh Ram, and they're using that, I think, in Israel in schools, because as the language evolves, and all languages evolve, it becomes harder and harder, especially for younger Israelis, to understand biblical Hebrew. And if any of you have ever had the experience of using biblical Hebrew in Israel, you'll know that people look at you in a very strange way and don't necessarily understand you. So the language is diverging. Just as English moved on from Chaucer, moved on past Shakespeare, moved on to the stage where I know, bat mitzvah kids who can't actually understand a lot of current translations of the Bible because they use words like thee and thou, with which they're completely unfamiliar. So because language always moves, translation will always be an issue, even if it's your own language. So we don't have to feel smug about, oh, well, we've got the original, we've got the Hebrew, because even if we are native Hebrew speakers, we may encounter problems. We also don't need to be ashamed about needing translations, because Jews have needed translations for 2,300 years. This is not a new problem at all. So translation is a vast and pretty complex field that most of us use without thinking twice about it. You pick up your Tanakh in English and that's it, isn't it? But very often there's much more to think about. And how many times have you picked up a Tanakh that you have in your house without even wondering, how did it get into this different language? Who were the translators? How did they do their work? What principles did they use? What do they do when they hit a problem? And translators have to make endless decisions and choices, and that will shape the nature of the end product. So I'm going to share the handout now. There we are. I hope you can all see that. Somebody wave if you can't. I started the handout with this wonderful quote from Hayim Nahman Bialik. He who reads his people's literature in translation is like one who kisses his mother's face through a veil. Unfortunately, that is true for most of us, really. So there's a really nice little encapsulation of why translation matters here that I just want to read part of this with you, because this puts it very clearly. It's written by somebody who's, I don't think he's even Jewish, Ernst Wertwein. He's a German biblical scholar, and he's written a book on the text. You can see the text of the Old Testament, but he says this: anyone who translates also interprets. The translation is not simply a rendering of the underlying text, but also an expression of the translator's understanding of it. And every translator is a child of his own time and of his own culture. Consequently, every translation must be understood and appreciated as an intellectual achievement in its own right. This is especially true of the versions of the Bible which were produced to meet the practical needs of a community, whether that was reading in shul, or whether that was home study, or whatever purpose a translation is made for, that will affect the translation. Most versions of the Bible have been the work of anonymous translators, usually of many translators, who've given concrete expression in their work to the intellectual assumptions of their age and their culture, the religious and other opinions which they adhere to or respect, the prejudices and concerns which they adopt consciously or unconsciously, their education, their ability to express themselves, the conceptual range of the language they are translating into, what's called the target language, and many other factors. And he suggests, he ends up by saying, we have to try and distinguish between what comes from the text and what comes from the translator, and that is tough. Okay, so that's quite an abstract thought about what is the problem of translation, but we're going to look at a really practical demonstration of it. And we will start with the very first two verses of the Torah, which provide a classical example of how difficult it is to translate Tanakh. Okay, and here we are, Bereshit chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Reshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. That's verse 1. Ve'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tohom v'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. So let's just go back and look at that and see what the problems are. The first problem is the first word. Reshit seems to be related to Rosh, head, which often means the start, like Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year, the start of the year. Bereshit is this in the beginning, at the beginning. And commentators and translators have had a big problem deciding what is that noun? Is it just a noun that stops there in the beginning, full stop? Or is it Reshit bara Elokim, the beginning of God's creating? And you'll find in our classical medieval commentators both understandings, and we'll see that in a moment in English translations. That changes the whole way we're going to look at those first two verses. The rest of the first verse is pretty easy. Then we hit the haaretz hayta tohu vavohu. The earth was tohu vavohu, a very rare phrase. The tohu part, I think, comes up again in Isaiah once or twice, but there's not, I don't think there's anywhere else in the whole Tanakh where tohu vavohu appear as a pair. What are they? Not sure at all. Not very clear. Then we have choshech al pnei tohom. There was darkness on the surface or the face of tohom, a deep, an abyss. Not quite clear what that is. And then we have the word ruach, which in itself is the perfect example of translation difficulty. Ruach can mean spirit, ruach can mean wind, and ruach can mean breath. Or it can mean all those things at once. But there is no word in English, certainly, that does that job of representing those three meanings. In English, you have to decide, is it a wind? Is it a breath? Is it a spirit? And right there, the translator has to choose something. And the last word I want to pick up on is that word merachefet. And that's a verb that seems to be used with birds. It means something like fluttering or hovering or some movement that's like a bird. So how do you attach that to a wind or spirit or breath? That's just to show you what difficulties a translator might actually face. Now we're going to have a look at a sample of translations and see how different translators attacked those problems. I'm going to start with the good old King James from 1611. We'll have a session later on when we talk about that. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Note the capitals. There are no capitals in Hebrew. What do capitals imply? And the earth was without form and void. That's tohu vavohu. But tohu vavohu are two things. So without form is an odd translation. They also chose to put verbs that didn't occur in the Hebrew in italics. And that's why darkness is in italics, because there is no verb is or was in the Hebrew. Of course, there is no verb at all for is, for the present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. They've chosen to describe the tohom as the deep, kept the original spelling here. And they've gone for Spirit of God, capitalized, moved. I rather like the spelling with the two O's because I think that sort of gives something birdy about it. Moved. It wasn't just moved, it's moved, maybe like a bird. Okay, so that's a really well-known translation. But you can get a lot more literal than that. Here is Young's literal translation, which did exactly what it says on the packet and took that word reshit as attached to bara Elokim. In the beginning of God's preparing the heavens and the earth hath existed waste and void, and darkness is, again, they've conscientiously put square brackets around is because it's not in Hebrew, on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God fluttering on the face of the waters. Okay, that's quite different. They've made a different choice for what you do with reshit. They have made different choices about that odd word merachefet. I'm going to skip Hertz because he's not very exciting, I'm afraid to say. Let's look at the Silberman edition of Rashi, where interestingly no translator is named at all. It's from 1935. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, no capitals, by the way. But the earth was desolate and void. Now tohu is suddenly desolate. And this is the bit I like. Darkness was on the face of the murmuring deep. Those of you who've read Aviva Zornberg's works will know she wrote a book called The Murmuring Deep, and I'm wondering whether she didn't get that phrase from here. But the murmuring deep, how do you get that out of Tahom? I don't know at all. And here we have the Merechepet word is hovering. Okay, and we're not going to do all of these. I want to pick up the interesting ones. The New Jewish Publication Society, a lot of people have the NJPS, good translation, but again, it makes decisions for you. When God began to create heaven and earth, so that's our second understanding of Reshit, the earth being unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep. Oh, and a wind from God. Oh, no more Spirit of God. Here it's a wind from God sweeping over the water. Contrast that with Art Scroll, which actually follows the same idea of beginning of something. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty. Where do they get astonishingly from? I'm guessing that the word tohu is related to a verb taha, to be amazed, and that's what they've done with tohu. The darkness on the surface of the deep and divine presence. So the ruach Elohim, the wind or the breath or the Spirit of God, has become the divine presence here. And we'll look at two more. Everett Fox, whose translation tried to recapture the feel of the Hebrew. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, see what is done there? Tohu vavohu, wild and waste. It's got the same rhythm in the alliteration. Darkness over the face of ocean. Tahom turns into ocean. Rushing Spirit of God hovering. So ruach, that difficult word that could be wind or breath or spirit, rushing spirit. He's trying to get it all into one phrase. And then a rather odd one by, I think he's a Lutheran pastor, Eugene Peterson, who found that his congregation were falling asleep during his sermons. And to wake them up, he decided he'd translate the Bible into contemporary English. And it worked, apparently. So this is you can get this one on the internet. It's called The Message. He's done the whole Bible. It's a little bit crazy, but one of its advantages is it makes you see the text as a totally new thing, shakes you out of your complacency. First this, Bereshit, in the beginning, yeah. God created the heavens and earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. Well, it's a lot of fun, actually. And I rather like brooded like a bird because it picks up that Merechepet language. But could you ever have imagined that you could have so many different translations of a very familiar verse? So I hope that's illustrated the choices that you have to make as a translator, because you hit something like the word Merechepet, and what are you going to do with it? Or you hit that word ruach that can mean 3 words in English. What are you going to do with it? So translation is an endless series of decisions and choices. And as we can see from all these different translations, and maybe afterwards you can go through them all and have some fun looking at the different solutions to these problems, those choices affect the way you, the reader, understand this passage. If you only knew Eugene Peterson's version with the soup of nothingness, the bottomless emptiness, and the inky blackness, might be a bit of a surprise if you went back to the King James, or indeed if you went back to the Hebrew. Okay, so we have these translations that are decisions, that are interpretations all the way through, and this is true of everywhere. That was just 2 verses. Yeah, you can imagine what happens elsewhere. I have to say the genealogies, no, you find on the genealogies, X produced Y, Y produced Z, those are all right. But almost everywhere else in the Bible, you're going to hit this sort of thing. Now, we can also, just seeing those translations, we can already begin to see they sort of group. If you imagine a spectrum of translation, at one end you have quite literal translations. I would put Everett Fox there, because the attempt, for instance, tohu vavohu, wild and waste, you can see he's really trying to hang on to the Hebrew. And the other end are what are called paraphrastic or not literal translations. And I would put the Message there for obvious reasons, the soup of nothingness and the bottomless abyss, etc. So between those perhaps extremes, you could probably fit all those other translations on that spectrum. And some would group up the literal end, and some would group up the not very literal end. And that might be something that you might be interested in as a reader of Tanakh, You might want something that follows the words very closely, even if it's inelegant sometimes. Or you might say, I want something that reads well, that sounds like a great piece of beautiful divine writing. To cut corners and make it more comprehensible. That's really what I want to know. I want to know what it means, not necessarily what it says. So again, you've got decisions as a translator. Which of those two paths, or where in the middle of that spectrum, are you going to put your particular translation? And we'll come back to some of these questions. You can break them down a little bit more. We've got this literal versus some sort of paraphrase. We've also got, of course, the difference in the way language works, the difference between the source language, in this sense, Hebrew, and the target language, in the examples we're looking at, English. Because, as you all know, Hebrew and English don't work the same way. In Hebrew, you have the root system. Most of the vocabulary is based on three-letter roots, which you can manipulate but maintain a connection between. You can't do that in English. So if you take the root shin mem resh, which has connotations of guarding and keeping, you can get lishmor, to guard, shmira, guarding, lishamer, to preserve. Oh, in English, we've already had to walk away from that word guard and find a completely different word. So that sort of playing with roots in Hebrew is almost impossible to reproduce in English. Sometimes people manage it. Very often they just can't do that, and they walk away. We also sometimes have rare and unique words in the original language that we don't know what they are anymore. For instance, in Vayikra, there's a list of non-kosher birds. We're not 100% sure what all those birds are in terms of what we now call birds. Some seem to be fairly clear. The atalef, I think everyone agrees the atalef is a bat, but there are various types of falcon that nobody's really absolutely sure what they're talking about. Some sort of bird. That's about as close as you can get and be sure you're correct. The other thing is, what about if the original text in the original language is really, really difficult? We don't understand it, even if we speak that language. What are you going to do when you have to translate it? You have to decide on some sort of meaning for it before you can put into another language. And that's a problem that translators hit the whole time. In fact, our example of ruach is a very good one. What does ruach mean in that context? Does it mean breath or spirit or wind or all of them? Or what exactly does ruach mean in that first verse of Bereshit? Because you have to make a decision if you want to translate that to English. So we're going to go back to some of those questions as we go through the different sessions and we look and see how different ages and different people translated or solve these problems in different ways. But there are other problems. What about theology? And here is the classic verse from Isaiah. Lachen yiten Hashem hu lachem ot. Hine ha'alma hara v'yoledet ben v'karat shemo Immanuel. King James knows exactly what it's doing there. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. And from very early times, Christians understood that as a reference to Jesus. And this is probably the verse that led to the doctrine of the virgin conception of Jesus. So it has a lot of theological weight for Christians. How did Jews translate that verse? Let's look at a recent 1985 New Jewish Publication Society. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child, not will conceive, and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. And if I just scroll down so you can see both of those, you can see how different those translations are. Virgin has disappeared. Young woman. And that's because it's the word Alma. Now, there's a perfectly good word for virgin in Hebrew, which is Betula. Alma means a young woman. Maybe a virgin, maybe not. The word doesn't actually give you that information. So the decision to translate it as virgin, which goes back to the Latin translation, virgo, has influenced or maybe reinforces a theological understanding of what this is talking about. By translating the young woman, it's very clear that that translation doesn't support this Christological or Christian understanding of that verse. And in fact, because also it sounds as though it's happening at that very time when the prophet is talking. The young woman is with child, as opposed to she will conceive in the future. It's much easier to relate it, as many Jewish commentators do, to the wife of the prophet Isaiah, or possibly the wife of the king of the time. In other words, it's not about a future Messiah or a future divine figure. It's about something that's happening right now. Somebody is pregnant, somebody's going to have a baby, call him Emmanuel, God is with us, and that will be a sign to the whole populace. And that is a very traditional Jewish understanding of this verse. But you can see it's got quite a theological load to it, and the translation makes that very clear. If you only knew the King James, you'd think that's what Isaiah meant. If you don't know the King James, and you just know something like the New Jewish Publication Society translation, you might be very surprised to know that that verse has been cited through Christians, by Christians from early antiquity on through the Middle Ages to today as proof that Jesus had a virgin birth. It's all in the translation. Okay. What about halakha? Translation can also affect our understanding of halakha, not just theology. So, for instance, we have the very well-known and very short commandment, lo tirtzach. How do we translate it? You shall not kill, or you shall not murder. A lot hangs on the difference. Killing is much more general. If the commandment says you shall not kill, then that would mean that every army in the world is illegal by God's law. Nobody can kill anyone else for any reason. That's it. You can't kill. Interestingly, if that were the case, one would think that the word laharog, which is the general term in Hebrew to kill, might have been used. Lo taharog, you shall not kill. The fact that the root resh tzadichet is used, which we associate with murder, with illegal and deliberate killing of somebody you should not do, that tends to give Jews one idea about this commandment. But other people who might translate it as thou shalt not kill or you shall not kill, a very different understanding. In most Christian translations, and certainly the King James, it says, you shall not kill. Many Jewish translations say translated as you shall not murder. And because of this much better known translation, you shall not kill, you get things like this. Here's somebody who won 2 Nobel Prizes who says, does the commandment thou shalt not kill mean nothing to us? Are we to interpret it as meaning thou shalt not kill except on the grand scale, or thou shalt not kill except when the national leaders say to do so? Possibly not a question you would ask if you stuck to the Jewish understanding of what tirtzach means. You shan't murder, you shall not kill illegally. And if it were a general commandment not to kill, that would be quite hard to square up with other portions of the Torah where God very clearly tells us that certain people should be killed at certain times, all those Sabbath infractions, and let that person be put to death. So either we would have to posit some theological exception for God, or we would have to struggle terribly with how this commandment fitted in with certain other passages of Tanakh. If you understand it as don't murder, it has a completely different meaning. So again, you can see that there are practical consequences to how you translate. Okay, so I might just pause here and have a look at the chat, which I can't see at the same time as this. So I just want to see if there are any questions in the chat.
A whole bunch of questions.
Okay, I'm just having a look. Here we are. Newbie question: what language are the earliest versions redacted? All in Hebrew for yonks. All in Hebrew till about 300 BCE when the first translation is made. So literally all in Hebrew except for a couple of tiny bits and later books that are in Aramaic. Murmuring from Homelibi, possibly related to Tehom, entirely possible that's where murmuring came from. It's an interesting one there. Yes, Jonathan Sacks is one. I've actually been asked to do a lecture on that, which I haven't got around to reading it yet, but I will be looking at it with enormous interest. What attempts in any were done to represent a translation according to maybe a Hendau sense, if Tov Vavohu, such other translations that try and and come up with a phrase. Not 100% sure I understand this. There are all sorts of translations. They're all, from overwhelming chaos to waste, or welter and waste, which I think is the Robert Alter one. There are hundreds of, I just took a tiny little sample of new translations because I couldn't even hope to cover the different things that have been done with those two verses. Where are we? Buber and Rosenzweig made up two rhyming words for Doberbo. They do indeed. Fox is very indebted to Buber and Rosenzweig. He is part of that same tradition of it shouldn't read like English, it should read like Hebrew. You should be constantly aware that it's not a nice, easy flowing English text. It's a text that is strange to us, and that's what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a Hebrew text, not a smoothed out text. So Fox is absolutely in that tradition. Alter is also, Alter's very literary approach. I'm quite fond of the Alter translation, and he's very focused on what the Hebrew does as well. But he's also interested in literary qualities, which I think Fox was less interested in. Okay, what else we got? What about where meaning is unclear? Yes, in source language, we discussed that. Yes, it's a terrible, terrible problem. We'll meet some of those as we go along. So I Not God is with us. Yes, Fox does that. Fox translates the meanings of the names. So if you, I don't know that Fox has done Isaiah, but if he did, he would be saying God with us, and he wouldn't put in Emmanuel. And he does that for place names as well, which makes it a slightly rocky read, but very interesting because you're constantly going, oh, I didn't know that place name meant that, or wow, that really resonates with the text. So it's a very, very, I rather like that. Not for quick reading, but for study reading, I like Fox and these ones that attack the Hebrew and wrestle with it rather than just going, well, we'll just gloss over that. Okay, natural bias introduction, assuming only English translations are valid. Oh, well, if I started on other languages, we'd never finish. So I am confining it to English for this session, but we will look at, also, I don't know how many languages, obviously many of you in Canada, so probably many of you have French capabilities as well. I have looked at translations into Swedish and French and other ones. And again, it's just, how long is a piece of string? But in the other sessions, we will look at Greek translations and we will look at Aramaic translations and see how the different characteristics of different languages did actually impact on it. But we're taking English as a specimen language because I'm presuming everyone can cope with the English, and I don't want to make assumptions about people's different language capabilities. Yes, every language is only a vernacular translation. Every translation is only a vernacular translation. That's it. A translation is, by definition, not the original language. Possible that Greek church fathers read a Greek word. If the word in Greek is Parthenos, which can mean a virgin, but can also mean a young woman. Parthenos is much more like Alma in some ways, but it has that double meaning. Alma, I don't know if you would actually go down the route of virgin unless you were nudged by theological considerations. But if you think of the Parthenon in Athens, that's the Athena Parthenos. It's the temple to Athena, who was a virgin goddess. But so it has both meanings there. Yes, the Koran is a major project. Most things are actually. I mean, the new JPS was a huge project, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of the projects that have been around and the multiple translators most of them use. Sometimes the unified project, sometimes they're not. Tehom clearly cognates Tiamat. Yes, again, that's going to depend on your theological orientation. If you don't really like the thought of Canaanite mythology influencing the vocabulary of the Bible, you're going to stay away from Tiamat. But if that doesn't bother you, you might go for that. And I think actually that's, wait a minute, let's look at the message. I have a feeling there's an echo of Tiamat. Bottomless emptiness, inky blackness? No, not so much, no. But yes, there have been translations that have tried to bring out these Canaanite resonances. And again, that's a decision made by the translator. Source sheets, I presume, are coming eventually. Is it sex translation known as Koran sex? I think so. Virgin birth, yeah, Septuagint, exactly. This is where it starts, Parthenos. That's where things start. Not exactly coming unpicked, but where you start having an opening for an understanding of this as virgin. Okay. How did mid-20th century Israeli Hebrew become such a different Hebrew? Well, all languages that are spoken by people move. None of them are fossilized. If you look at English, if you just look at a Victorian novel, you'll see that 100 years later, we're speaking a very, very different English from what Charles Dickens did. If you go back to Shakespeare, it's even more different. If you go back to Chaucer, it's still more different. And if you go back to Beowulf, you can't understand a word. So languages constantly change and constantly move. And if you think of it, for a good illustration, slang. Think of this slang you knew as a younger person and slang that has come in since. You know, all those words that young people come up with and you go, I don't know what that is. Never heard of that. Or just think of our adaptation of language to computers, motherboards, mouse, download, update, all these things, upgrade. We're all coping very nicely with them. We've learned a whole new vocabulary with COVID. Yeah. Words none of us knew before. Some of us weren't too sure what pandemics were before. Now we know. So as life happens to you, language moves. And it's some people even date languages or phases of languages by how much they differ from earlier phases. So that's just a natural thing. Even Hebrew changed. Mishnaic Hebrew is completely different from biblical Hebrew. And modern Israeli Hebrew is based much more on Mishnaic Hebrew than it is on biblical Hebrew. And then you look at medieval Hebrew and rabbinic Hebrew, 19th century revivalist literary Hebrew, which is incomprehensible today, which derives from the Bible, but it's completely different. So language moves, and gradually classics need to be translated after X amount of time. When kids don't understand things anymore, you really need to start thinking about how do you make it available to them. Okay, what else we got? Murray meant that most translations more colloquial languages. I'm not sure what you mean by colloquial. The vernacular is just something that people speak. So yeah, missionaries are very often invented writing systems in order to translate the Bible, but every language, every translation of the Bible, whether it's into ancient Ethiopic or Armenian, has been into a language that people were speaking at the time. As indeed Aramaic, which Jews don't really speak much anymore, but we still have those translations. Hebrew has changed less than 3,000 years, yes, because it wasn't spoken by the common people till quite recently. So it's probably now changing at the same, well, yes, if anyone here lives in Israel, you'll know the rate of absorption of English words into Hebrew is absolutely stunning. And actually also the grammatic and syntactical features of English are flooding into Hebrew at the moment because English is a world-dominating language and English is changing Hebrew. Whereas, say, when Hebrew was revived in the time of Eliezer ben Yehuda, it was Russian that was influencing Hebrew. I remember being told ages ago that the best translation to read for War and Peace is not an English translation, but a Hebrew one, because it's much closer in linguistic terms. Okay. So let's get on to our second point. What is the text that we're translating here? And this is an interesting question. I can unshare for the moment. We'll get back to the share in a little moment. Okay, so these are also distinctly, this point is distinctly related to translation because you have to have a text to translate. And we tend to think of, well, the Bible is the Bible. But there's more than one version, I am sorry to tell you. All modern Bible translation, however, does use a particular version, what's called the Masoretic text. Okay, the Masoretic text is the gold standard. It, however, doesn't exist in one version. The Masoretic text exists in several versions. So which are you going to choose? Generally, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it matters a lot. In session 4, we'll look at the work of the Masoretes who produced the Masoretic version in much greater detail. But for now, we can characterize the Masoretic text as the text that has been standard since the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So it's got a long, long, long history. Okay. So, or we could say maybe the family of very closely variants of that has been standard since 70 CE. Now, most of the variants are tiny. A missing vav, an extra yod, what are known as the maleh and chaser, the full and the lacking or defective spellings. And that doesn't usually make a whole heap of difference to the meaning. But what evidence do we have for the original spellings? What evidence do we have for the original text of Tanakh? Well, the good and the bad news is until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, our oldest manuscripts of Tanakh were from the Middle Ages, and they were all variants of the Masoretic text, absolutely every last one of them. Now, however, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date from between 250 BCE up to 70 CE, and they are now our earliest copies of the Tanakh at all. So we don't have the whole Tanakh in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have 23 of the 24 books. There is no Book of Esther at Qumran, the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. We do have multiple copies of some books. So, for instance, there are lots and versions of Dvarim. We have at least 30 copies of Dvarim. In those days, the entire Chumash wasn't written on one scroll. It was written separately. Bereshit was one scroll, Shemot was one scroll, and so on. Some of them are fragmentary. We have 21 copies of Isaiah, which is great. We have 36 copies of Tehillim. But other books we don't have so many of. Most are fragmentary, so we don't necessarily have complete copies of all these. And we have about 200 biblical manuscripts in total. And biblical texts, as a proportion of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are about 22%. The rest is literature we're not going to discuss at all, stuff like hymns and manual of discipline, all sorts of stuff. So about 12 of them are written in Paleo-Hebrew, which is the old Hebrew alphabet that we don't use anymore. The rest are written in what we think of as Hebrew, which is actually Aramaic script. And at Qumran, you can divide those biblical texts into 3 groups. There is the Samaritan family text, which the Samaritans of today, I won't get into, but there are very small, about 800 of them left. They have their own version of the Torah. They don't actually have the rest of Tanakh. They only have Torah. And I think the book of Joshua. And their text, for instance, anywhere that our version, the Masoretic version, says, in the place that God will cause his name to dwell, the Samaritan version says Mount Gerizim. A couple of other variations as well. So we do have Dead Sea Scrolls that reflect the Samaritan version. We then have manuscripts that are obviously the origin of our Masoretic version, because they're very close. And we have a third group that looks as though it reflects a Hebrew version that was behind the Septuagint translation, the earliest translation of the Bible that we'll discuss next week into Greek, that was done by Jews. And the Septuagint has a little bit of variation, small variations from the Masoretic text here and there, and the Hebrew text found at Qumran, there is this group that reflect that look like the Septuagint's original text. So we have these 3 things. There are lots of minor spelling things. Place names are crazy. Nobody agrees on place names in these manuscripts. Sometimes the grammar's a little different. Sometimes a different word is substituted here or there. Sometimes gender of words changes. Sometimes the word is left out or an extra word from what we'd expect. There is even, we'll discuss it in a moment, a complete paragraph that we don't have in the Masoretic version, but we found at Qumran. And this is interesting stuff, because it seems to imply that there was not one standardized text of the Bible. This is a bit of a heretical thought, or at least a challenging thought, but a lot has been written about this, and I recommend this fabulous article by Menachem Cohen called The Idea of the Sanctity of the Biblical Text and the Science of Textual Criticism. He wrote this a long time ago, and at the end of the handout, I put a link where you can find a translation. It was an article originally in Hebrew. There's a very nice English translation up on the internet. You can read the whole thing. But I've just put in an abbreviated version of his conclusions here. He himself teaches at Bar Ilan. Well, if he still does, he might have retired. He's an Orthodox rabbi. And these are the conclusions he drew from the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Number 1, there were several text types of the scriptural text. In essence, all the Hebrew text types represented by our Masoretic text, as well as those behind the Septuagint and the Samaritan text, were used by the Qumran sect in their study and worship. Besides those 3 major types, the multiplicity of text types we just described, the Qumran scrolls show a lot of subtypes when you get down to orthographic variants. That's variants in spelling, whether you have a vav or you don't have a vav at the beginning of the word, variant words and so on. Point 3 is pretty important for us. Even the Masoretic type found at Qumran is not identical letter for letter with the Masoretic text we know today. In most cases, the similarity between the Qumran text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Masoretic texts are along general lines, not the spelling, not the orthographic identity. It shows that the Qumran scribes didn't have the notion of an ideal text, not the way we do now. We definitely have that ideal now. The lack of an authorized single Masoretic text at Qumran can be proved by the correction methods used by the scribes. Corrections and additions can be found in many of the scrolls. It's obvious they're not based on a single text either. And again, when you look at the tefillin and mezuzot from Qumran, again, they vary a bit. We're very fussy about our tefillin and our mezuzot. They have to be absolutely letter perfect, not at Qumran. So that's pretty interesting. Now, spelling may not be a big deal, and if I've just put in an illustration of documented spellings of Shakespeare's name between 1564 and 1616, and you can see that there was no agreement on Shakespeare's spelling. Okay, so does it make the slightest bit of difference to us today in our opinion of Shakespeare? No. So you can get hung up about spelling and how important it is. But what it does seem to show is there just wasn't an idea that you had to have a text that every single letter in your particular copy was absolutely identical to every single letter in everybody else's copy. Didn't seem to be a thing back then. Now, there is an argument that maybe it was just the people at Qumran and they were a bit peculiar. But we can also see a little bit of evidence from a tiny bit later. So there are other sites near the Dead Sea where different biblical manuscripts were found. We've talked about Qumran, put down, this is roughly what I told you just now. Masada, there are some biblical fragments from there. Wadi Murubat, there are some manuscripts from there, including one of the Treasa, the minor prophets. And Nachal Keva, we have the minor prophets in Greek, and we have some Psalms, I think, in Hebrew. Okay? So you can see it's a little bit later. Masada up to 73, which is when the Romans burnt everything down. Wadi Murubat up to the time of Bar Kokhba, and Nachal Keva, again, up to the time of Bar Kokhba. So it's difficult to say it was only Qumran, because though all these ones from Masada, Wadi Murubat, and Nachal Keva, they are all Masoretic text variants, but they don't agree on spelling either. So it seems as though by this point, the Samaritan text was only being used by Samaritans. The Septuagint was not being used by Jews in the land of Israel, perhaps. But the Masoretic text, which was being used by Jews, again, was not letter perfect. So this may surprise you. Medieval Jews were perfectly aware of this variation. There are a lot of halachic discussions along the lines of somebody writing to a rabbi in the Middle Ages and going, this bloke from up the road came to our community and he's a sofer, and he looked at our scrolls and he said they're full of mistakes and he wants to change them all, but there are father's scrolls and our grandparents' scrolls, and we don't think there's anything wrong with them, and can we tell them to leave our scrolls alone? And this would happen quite often when a scribe, a sofer, moved from one community to another, because there were different local traditions. Again, we're mostly talking on the spelling level, but still, if you think about our modern insistence that no, all copies of the Torah are exactly the same, well, they weren't in the Middle Ages. The thing that made them much more similar was actually printing. Somebody's got a question there, Sivan? Do you want to ask your question?
More than translation, even the original text, the biblical Hebrew, when we read the biblical Hebrew today, either Hebrew or the Aramaic source, do we understand in Hebrew, in the source language, what was actually said? Sometimes there is a great...
as we said before, not necessarily. No, that we were talking about that in the first half. Yes, we don't necessarily understand exactly. We use the example of the birds in Leviticus. We don't know 100% which birds they were. And there are other places where the Hebrew is very difficult. So we have to make decisions about what we understand by the original Hebrew. Okay.
Excuse me, but also the Nicodem.
Can we just wait with some more questions and do them at the end if you don't mind, because just want to make sure we cover the material, and then you might find some of the answers actually as we go along, and if not, please ask your questions at the end. Okay, so we said that medieval rabbis were aware that Torah scrolls varied from community to community, and actually we still have that. Yemenite Torah scrolls are different from Ashkenazi ones in 11 places. They still have slight differences, mostly place names. A bet for a cup or a cup for a bet. So it's not exactly, the standard doctrines of Judaism are not going to fall on this. But it's interesting when you think about the development, the much later development, the idea that all our Torah scrolls are exactly the same and we only have one version of the Masoretic text. And the truth is we don't only have one version of the Masoretic text. Our idea that things should be similar, as I said, probably is related to printing. And that starts by the fact that the version of the Masoretic text most often used descends from the 1525 printing of the Torah by Yaakov ben Hayim, who sounds lovely, except I have to tell you, we did convert to Christianity a bit later on. And he printed something called the Mikra'ot Gedolot, and it's his second edition that is still the basis of what most Jews use today. But it's not a very good version, and it doesn't actually take account of a lot of much more strongly supported spellings and variants in the Masoretic text. And one of the interesting things about this whole question about text is, have we lost anything? The Dead Sea Scrolls seem to suggest we might have. The most exciting bit is part of the book of Shmuel Aleph, the first book of Samuel. And here it is, what we've got. We're not going to read the whole thing, but the version we have today, chapter 11, starts like this. Nachash the Ammonite marched up and besieged Yavesh Gilad. All the men of Yavesh Gilad said to Nachash, make a pact with us and we will serve you. But Nachash the Ammonite answered them, I will make a pact with you on this condition, that everyone's right eye be gouged out. I will make this a humiliation for all Israel. The elders of Yavesh said to him, give us 7 days respite, so we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. If no one comes to our aid, we will surrender to you. When the messengers came to Givat of Shaul, and gave this report in the hearing of the people, all the people broke into weeping. And the rest of the story is about how King Shaul rescues this city from the Ammonites. But a little bit odd. Why is there, why are they fighting? It doesn't tell you. We seem to start in the middle of the story. Interestingly, one manuscript from Qumran had a missing paragraph that appears just before the beginning of the story. And it starts, Nachash, king of the children of Ammon, sorely oppressed the children of Gad and the children of Reuben, and he gouged out all their right eyes and struck terror and dread in Israel. There was not left one among the children of Israel beyond the Jordan whose right eye was not put out by Nachash, king of the children of Ammon, except that 7,000 men fled from the children of Ammon, and entered Yavesh Gilad. About a month later, Nachash the Ammonite marched up and besieged Yavesh Gilad. Explains the story. Okay, what did he have against Yavesh Gilad? They were refugees from all the people he was oppressing across the other side of the Jordan, and he'd already done this campaign of putting out the right eye of all the people he had conquered in battle. So it's not so, what they say in Yiddish, mitten drinnen. It's not sort of in the middle of the story so much. It gives you a bit of a background. The other interesting thing is it is standard in Tanakh for the first mention of a character to say who he is. And the missing paragraph does that. Nachash, king of the children of Ammon. It tells you exactly who he is. Our version, Nachash the Ammonite, doesn't tell you who's the king. So it is entirely possible that that was the original start of that book. Now, this has no theological importance whatsoever. It really doesn't matter who Nachash was. But it's fascinating to think that maybe what happened was a scribe's eye went from the word Nachash here. He looked down, he wrote that Nachash, and then he went back and his eye went back to this Nachash, and he missed out the bit in between. We've all done it. There's even a name for it. It's called homotiluten. It's a special name for a scribal error. Not at all uncommon. Maybe that's what happened. We don't know. But what about when we come to translations? Do we put it in? Do we leave it out? Is it part of the Bible? isn't it? And that's pretty interesting. And if we look at how translators deal with textual questions like that, we're going to find out a lot goes on that you don't know about because they don't tell you that at all. Okay, so Robert Alter gives us the entire paragraph that's missing, the Dead Sea Scroll paragraph, at the bottom of the page in his commentary. So he says, here it is. I'm not putting it back in the main text, but here it is. Interesting. Maybe this fell out. Everett Fox mentions that there's a paragraph, summarizes it, doesn't give you the whole thing. The New Jewish Publication Society has a footnote that reproduces just that little phrase about a month later. And the Study Bible version of the NJPS summarizes the paragraph. Dat Mikra, which is a modern Israeli commentary on the entire Bible, it's a modern Orthodox commentary, mentions Qumran material. When it gets to this bit of Shmuel, it doesn't mention the fact that there is a missing paragraph or might be a missing paragraph at all. Just doesn't mention it. So different translators and different editions have different attitudes to things like textual questions. Particularly in non-Jewish translations, you will find that they make a lot of use of Qumran material and alternative versions, and they don't always tell you. So the New Living Translation, which is a Christian one, on its website says the translators of the Old Testament use the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible as their standard text. We also compare the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc., etc. But they also tell you what else they use. They use the edition known as Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. What's that? It's an edition of the Masoretic text based on the Lenigre Codex. What's the Lenigre Codex? The oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, dated to about 1008 or maybe 1009. And that's what their translation is based on. You have to go to the website to find out. That's not actually the same as the Masoretic text that most Jews use. A little bit different, small things. I can tell you who does use it, and that is the Israeli army, because way back, Rabbi Mordechai Brauer was a big fan of the Lenigre Codex, and he insisted that the army Bibles that get given out to soldiers when they pass out, when they do their basic training, should be the Lenigre Codex. So if you want a copy of the Lenigre Codex, just find an army Bible from Israel, and that will give you the Hebrew version of the Lenigre Codex, which is interesting. Okay, so to go back to the Christian translation, the New Living Translation, it turns out that they don't quite tell you where they incorporate stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or from looking at the Septuagint translation, or looking at the Samaritan version of the Bible, or looking at the Syriac Pshita, which is a Syriac, an ancient, it's a language like Aramaic, it's an ancient translation of the Bible, or the Latin Vulgate translation. They don't tell you necessarily. So you don't quite know what base text they are translating, which is interesting. So you can even get to the stage that there's a Danish translation from 1995, which is standard in Denmark for the Danish churches, which actually has 1,500 differences from the Masoretic text that we know and use, using a lot of Qumran material, but also using material from other ancient translations of the Bible. So the translators have actually created their own original text and translated that. So you might not know. It's always worth going back to the introductory pages and finding out which text did they use as their basis, as their source text for translation. It's much less of a problem with Jewish ones. Most Jewish ones just go, well, we're going to go with the traditional Masoretic text. But if you do use a non-Jewish translation, you need to be aware that you might need to check that. Otherwise, you might have a bit of a patchwork of text being translated. So many of the modern translations we'll be looking at were indeed based on the Masoretic text. But again, if you want to decide which translation you want to use, that might be a very important factor for you. What is the version that's being used? How much of this is actually Dead Sea Scrolls emendations or Septuagint emendations, and how much is the Hebrew text that I know? And does that matter to me? To some people, it doesn't matter so much. To other people, it matters a great deal. So we can see that going right back to the choice of text to translate is the first question we have when we come to translation. Okay. So I'll just describe the coming sessions, so you know what we've got. Next week, we'll look at the Septuagint, the first translation of the Bible into any language other than Hebrew, into Greek, done by Jews. That's 300 BCE and following centuries. And we'll talk about its effect and its use by Christians as well as Jews. Session 3, we'll look at the Targums, the ancient Aramaic translations of the Bible made by Jews in both the land of Israel and Babylonia, which we still use. Why? Then we'll do the Masoretes. Where did the vowels come from? Why are they important? Why should everyone love the Masoretes? Session 5, we'll look at translations of the Bible in Europe, starting around about the Reformation and just before, and how the first Bibles in English were produced. And then sessions 6 and 7, we will be reading the translations to assess them. How do they work? How do you make informed choices about which translation to use and what you just need to be aware of when you're using a translation? So I'm ready to answer any questions. If anyone would like to ask any. There's some more that I haven't seen from the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much. While you look at the chat box, take a minute or so, I'll just say, of course, I just posted that our new upcoming series, which sort of very nicely parallels this, totally coincidental. Dr. Moshe Sokolov will be beginning a series on how Tanakh evolved Wednesday. Of course, he taught the Haftarot all last year, and just about 10 days ago, he told me what he wants to teach this year about how Tanakh evolved. So I think it'll be a nice companion. Of course, to those who came last year to his Haftarot class, it's well worth listening to. That begins this Wednesday at 8 p.m. Tonight, of course, Mark Shapiro continues with Great Rabbinic Figures, part 9, I believe, of Shaul Lieberman. Tomorrow, Rachel Danziger continues her series on relationships in Genesis. Wednesday, Rav Carmel Be'ivrit, David HaMelech Miyaseh Shel Medinat HaAtzma'it HaRishona, Zeh Yashir Be'achad V'Reva B'Sha'at Mizrach. I don't know, Eastern time, they probably say. That's probably got English into Hebrew, I don't know. That's 1:15 B'ivrit, Rav Carmel, the Rosh Kol of Eretz Chemda. Thursday, as we mentioned, Shuli Mishkin, she's marrying off a son. She will not be giving the shir this week. So this Thursday, no shir at 11 a.m. with Shuli, but the Parsha shir 8:30 live from Sydney, Australia, 10:30 Friday morning in Sydney, but those who live on the East Coast, 8:30 Thursday evening, Rabbi David Blackman, and then, of course, my shir on the Siddur at 9:30 on Friday morning, and Menachem Leibtag next Sunday. Okay, with all that announcements, I hope, Lindsay, you can concentrate on the chat box and answer any questions.
I'll go down the chat ones first, and then we'll take the people who've got their hands up. That's okay.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Dave, for putting in the point that the Talmud itself says we are not sure about Maleh and Chaser, and that's actually probably the basis of the fact we don't make a bracha when we write a Sefer Torah, because we're not absolutely sure we've got all the letters right, etc. There's more than one example in Rashi of slight differences in spellings. There's several examples in Rashi. Due to Nikud and ambiguous Hebrew spelling, Hebrew can be read with a variety of meanings. Indeed. Exactly, and this is almost impossible to reproduce in English. So yeah, this is one of the problems of translation. Absolutely. Read today might not understand exactly what the biblical verse will intend to convey. Absolutely, that's why there's a whole interpretation and perush industry, because we're all trying to make sense of the Bible. Yes, we have. We know that there were different. We actually know there were simultaneously different versions of Torah spelling. For instance, the Talmud tells us that there were 3 Torah scrolls kept in the temple, and they had slight variations in spelling. And that when you're not sure, you take the majority of the evidence, and that's what you use. Which is interesting. It could be the Qumran edition added in the explanatory paragraph, but it's an easier assumption to presume that it fell out because some scribe didn't actually remember to copy it. You would then you're still left with the problems of why isn't Nachash described as a king, and why have we no background to this story? Because it would be a unique example of just the story starting in the middle without a back to without a start to it. It's harder. What else have we got? Right. Okay, so I think we can go to the
live box. Those want to unmute himself. Okay, Susanna, Vakasha.
Yes, just a quick comment. There's a wonderful book written by Avia Kushner. She's a writer who wrote a book called The Grammar of God. She grew up in a Hebrew-speaking home, And the first time she looked at the Tanakh in English was when she was in college or graduate school, and she was horrified. She's in the first chapter of the book. She says, "I looked at it and I said, that's not what it says." So it's a wonderful book for those of you who are not familiar with it. The Grammar of God.
Excellent. I haven't heard of it, but I'm just going to look for it. It sounds fascinating.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay. Jay, Bakasha.
This is actually a suggestion, Rabbi Kelman, in your desire to increase the participation. A technical question: when and where will a recording of this session be found? Because there are several people I can now think of. I should have told.
All our recordings can be found in more than one way. The easiest way is go to the program page for this program. Go to our Torah Motion website, go under programs, that's all the programs. Click on this program. We record all the recordings under the program. You can also go to Tim Torah, and there the recordings are recorded chronologically. So you'll have the latest recording first. Can also, and then we have a search button, so you can type in the name, the date, the topic, and you'll get it. So how long does it take? Our web guy promises to have them up within 24 hours, in which he does 99.9% of the time. Occasionally he gets them up in 6 hours, 12 hours, depends on his schedule. So don't ask me how to do it, and he got to edit it, but he's very good. So they're generally up within 24 hours. I don't know if 99% of the time, but almost always, and sometimes, sooner. So just, check back by either tonight or tomorrow morning. I'm sure it'll be up.
Thank you. We'll help with recruiting.
We have thousands of recordings. Like I mentioned once before, we have like over 1,000 recordings from before COVID, before half the people here heard of Torah in Motion, who are new to Torah in Motion. They knew us much more as a Toronto-based organization, doing all our programs in Toronto. So we got, if we would record on Shabbat, we'd have 5,000, but no, we didn't record our programs on Shabbat. What can I say? Didn't rely on a Shabbos Goy or anything like that. So talking about Shabbos Goy, by the way, I will mention, I'm sure many of you saw, Colin Powell passed away this morning, and of course he was a good friend of the Jewish people, as I understand, and I think he was a Shabbos Goy as a young kid anyway, so just, mention in passing. Bakasha. Okay, now you can play Jewish geography as much as you want. Lindsay, we'll let you go.
Did Nadia have a question? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Is there another question? I'm sorry.
Well, she asked in the middle, so I was thinking, did you still want to ask the question, or did it get cleared up?
I wrote it in. And that was the one about the vowels.
About the vowels, yes. Well, the vowels, when we get the Masoretes, it's
like, I don't believe that Chana would have said that Yalda Shiva, because she wouldn't have spoken about numbers. She would have said Sava, I was satisfied. That's one of my examples. It's a bit way out.
So once you have vowels, it fixes the meaning in certain ways. So are they a blessing or are they a curse? I have to say, I rather think they're a blessing, because nobody would ever learn to read Torah without the vowels. But, it would be murder. Can you imagine? Can you imagine laning? No vowels. I mean, bad enough the Sefer Torah doesn't have them, but nothing to prepare from, and everyone giving their own interpretation. It would be absolutely awful. Which is
nothing to correct, though. You can never correct the Bakore.
Yes, that is a good point. Yes, might be nice for some, Pali. Correct. Sorry.
Basic thing that a translation is not math. And the minute and the minute you say this, it has to be interpretive, because one of my pet peeves is when people speak about a knitted kippah. There is no such thing. It's crocheted. In Hebrew, you have two words for. You have in English, you have two words.
And in Hebrew, it's lisrog. Yes.
To crochet and to knit.
Yes, and that's a classic example. Yeah, absolute classic example. Yeah.
Rivka, you have a question, I think?
I just wanted to comment that, interestingly enough, at the risk of admitting my ignorance, I had never heard of the Masoretes. And just last Thursday, we learned about them in Shuli's class when she was speaking about Tiberia and the importance of the migration of Jewish thought and leaders up to the north. And there you go.
Kol Torah inyan achad, who the rabbis say. All of Torah is interconnected. One shear plays off the other. Totally, people not knowing. Yeah, I find it very beautiful, and so often this happens. One speaker mentions it, and it's picked up by another speaker who didn't hear the first speaker. And yes. Of course, Shuli mentioned the Masoretes, but they're not in the details. It's going to be very, very different, of course. She just said, I was about Feria. No, she was talking about Feria, so the Masoretes being in Feria wasn't really a thing. She mentioned, I mean, the different families. She didn't get into all the details, the different families of all the Masoretes, but
But it was
you'll
the
do
first
that.
time I had learned of them, and now here you are giving a dagesh on.
Yes, I think
That's
they're
what it
very
is.
unknown. They're very unknown. I teach all my bat mitzvah kids about them because nobody, I don't think anyone who's not an adult reads for themselves in the UK knows about the Masoretes. And I love the Masoretes, and we owe them such a debt, and they're wonderful, and they preserve the text for us, and nobody loves them. So I'm hoping by the end of the session on the Masoretes, you will all, I don't know, get a T-shirt which says, I love the Masoretes, and you should too, because they were fabulous people. Plus, they were the first computer nerds before there were computers. So if anyone around here is a bit of a computer geek, you're going to love the Masoretes. Yeah.
Listen, as you said, just as language evolves, what people learn evolves. And correct, nobody learns that stuff. And where nobody learns this, it's not, there are a lot of reasons for that, which we can discuss another time. There's a little danger, of course, in the world we live in today. They don't want to expose certain people to these ideas because it's sort of goes against the Rambam's view of how the Torah was put together, but that's for another time. Okay, maybe last question, because we want to let Dr. Rabba Guthartz go, but Barry, you can have the last word. I see your hand is up.
Thank you. Wonderful class. And it's not just that the courses overlap with other courses, but that the courses sometimes overlap with the news. And it's interesting, we looked at the word Alma today, and as some of us, I'm sure know, Colin Powell's wife's name, first name is Alma.
That I did not know.
Pretty amazing also that we have that connection too.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. He was married 58 years, I think. I'm married 62. I think they said, anyways, 59 years. Okay. No, we should have happy occasions. We look forward to seeing you next week. We look forward to seeing everybody else even sooner. And we look forward to you inviting your friends to come and join one class, many classes, and let them go. Everybody have a wonderful day. And next class, as mentioned tonight, of course, 8:30 with Mark Shapiro. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Be well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.